and welcome. We are so excited to be here today in conjunction with our partners here at eCornell. This is the first in a 5-part series that's brought to you by the Scheinman Institute's Employment and Labor ADR Hub. The Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution at Cornell University promotes interdisciplinary education, research, and training in dispute resolution for students, academics, neutrals, and practitioners. And its Employment and Labor ADR Hub is a destination for arbitrators, mediators, other neutrals, advocates, practitioners, students, and educators to discuss current issues within and impacting the field of dispute resolution. This 5-part series, as I mentioned, is also brought to you by members of Cornell's Restorative Practices Professional Learning Group. This cross-divisional and interdisciplinary group hosts monthly virtual circle conversations that build community, address and problem-solve current issues on campus, and engage in topic-based learning about restorative practices and alternative dispute resolution. This group hopes to develop personal and professional habits of restorative practice that can transform our relationships, departments, neighborhoods, communities, and families. So for today's panel, we will be discussing reflective pedagogies and faculty partnerships for academic engagement, including classroom experiences, other faculty engagements on campuses, and research. And our panel today consists of members of our Cornell community, as well as 2 faculty members from our from other institutions. So let's start with a little round of introductions. First of all, I'm Katrina Nobles. I am the Director of Conflict Programs in the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution in the ILR School at Cornell University. Next, I'd like to go to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Moriello. I'm an assistant professor at Notre Dame University in Maryland.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And Jeremy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Rinker, and I'm Associate Professor in Peace and Conflict Studies at University of North Carolina, Greensboro.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. And Liz.
Hey, my name's Liz. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Scheinman Institute Fellow working in conflict programs at the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution in the ILR School at Cornell University.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today. So basically, we're going to start with a few questions. We're each going to provide some context from the areas where we work and research and learn. We would like to encourage our audience members to post questions in the chat. We will be taking questions at the end of our panel discussion today. So please make sure you're posting them there, and our producers will get those questions over to us. So we're going to start a little bit by talking about restorative-focused classroom experiences and pedagogies. And so I'd like each of our panelists to be able to give a bit of a description about kind of the pedagogies that they've used in the classroom and the experiences that they've had from those. So this time I'm going to start with Jeremy.
Great. So yeah, I've used in my classroom both role play around restorative practices as well as circle process. And I was thinking about particularly a writing intensive class that I taught a few semesters back, in which I used circle quite often, and it really developed, I used it more often probably than in most classes. I tend to use a little bit of circle in all my classes, but it really developed a sense of kind of relationship and feeling as if they were part of a class, where I think oftentimes that doesn't happen in a classroom. So pedagogically, that's kind of the way in which I use it. I also am excited by the fact that you guys have kind of what I might call a circle of practice, because I've also done that kind of work on my campus, really more outside of the classroom, trying to create a space similar to what you described, Katrina, in terms of, you know, a space where people could talk about restorative practices, the philosophies of it, what's worked, what hasn't, and how to build those skills.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Lauren, did you want to discuss some of the pedagogies you've used?
Sure. Thanks. So I currently am an assistant professor in the School of Education at Notre Dame, and I work with both students who are going back to school for higher education leadership and students who are pursuing their master's degree in K-12. So I'm modeling using circles and other restorative practices, which we think sometimes, we put to the side, but actually and end up building community and modeling for students and others in our communities some of the skills that are necessary in order to engage in circles. So I'm thinking about using restorative questions, for example, what happened, what were you thinking, who was impacted, what have you thought about since, those kinds of questions, in addition to affective statements. So both using them and modeling them and being really explicit about what they do for us from a restorative perspective to build community, address behavior, and to help kind of normalize the use of those practices for my students in the classroom. I've also had the pleasure of having a career outside of the classroom. I started off my career working in student affairs and building a curriculum for residential students that utilize restorative practices as the main method of delivering both information and building community. So the idea being that we can't learn until there's a baseline of trust and respect and common understanding. And so we kind of approached the community building and leadership aspects of co-curricular life that way. And that was a really, really fruitful way for the students to kind of gain some of the skills that they wanted to carry into their careers as well as into the classroom.
Great. So it sounds like from both of your experiences, these practices overlap a lot between the classroom and other things that are happening on campus. So I think we're going to delve into that just a little bit more in a minute. But Liz, do you want to share a little bit about class experience and pedagogy?
Yeah. So I will say it's weird being on the other side of a classroom so soon after being a student, even though we're all lifelong learners and like every aspect of existing in some way or form is being in a classroom. But what we've been doing and what I've been thinking about a lot is ways to, I guess, integrate pop culture and just like other things that aren't typically considered like high knowledge into the classroom. And so like specifically for the course that I co-teach with Katrina, when we are trying to get our students to think about conflict within themselves and also like within just real life, sometimes it's hard to connect that to the types of cases that they're mediating, if that makes sense. And so I always say, like when reflecting on my experience of how I ended up in this position, it's really the fact that once you take a course like Campus Mediation Practicum, which I'm sure Katrina will share a little bit more about in a second, you start to realize how essential it is to try to integrate these practices into your life, right? And so the reason that the pop culture examples have been so, I guess, beneficial for our students is because it's a way for them to see that not only is conflict inevitable, but it also manifests in a lot of different ways that are also like relevant to the way that we just think about communicating with each other and just navigating the world around us. And then also connecting that to pedagogy, like integrating the cycle of socialization and liberation into our coursework has also been really exciting and I think really impactful for the students because, again, it's a way to not only think about conflict externally with regard to mediating a case, but also think about how the things relevant to how we became the people that we are. So how we were socialized and different like levels of conflict internally and externally also impact the way that we navigate situations and communicate with others. So yeah, it's been really cool, a really cool little experiment that we've been playing around with, and lots of excitement around just like students being excited about being engaged. So when you ask them, like one discussion board post that we did was asking students to watch some TV, watch some YouTube, play some games, and share examples of conflict that they've seen in pop culture somewhere and share that with the class and try to put themselves in a potential mediator spot when watching like the 90 Day Fiance or a reality TV show, and asking them how they would navigate that experience and communicate with those people in the space. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. So with regard to what Liz was talking about, that's our campus mediation practicum 1 and 2 courses at Cornell. So for us, we were really seeking ways to kind of institutionalize dispute resolution and restorative practices at Cornell. And one way to do that was through the classroom. And so coming up with ways that we could incorporate both the theoretical underpinnings of dispute resolution and restorative justice, while also providing a space in which students can practice those skills, was really important as we were creating the program. So our program is actually connected with our Office of Student Conduct, our residential programs, our student organizations, and then other sort of informal groups on campus as well. And our students are undergraduates, graduates, and law students. So our classes are cross-listed with the law school. And so a couple of things that we found really interesting in terms of bringing the pedagogy in the room is, first and foremost, to bring the roots of restorative justice into the room. So talking about the indigenous roots of restorative justice, and kind of how we both remember and apply those things as we're practicing, not just in perfunctory ways, but actually thinking about where do these practices come from, and are we actually honoring the original practices or not? And then how does that play a role in how we come into the room and understand the practice more fully? And then being able to practice exactly what we're hoping the students will be able to do with other students in the classroom, things like restorative justice circles. We do sort of a modified version called an impact circle, where the students can talk about impacts from specific events. And we actually use that in the classroom as a learning feature. They can talk about their own experience in impactful events, but then they also have the opportunity to facilitate those types of circles outside of the classroom as part of their learning. So for instance, we just had our students facilitating impact circles with our first year and transfer students at the ILR school, which was an amazing experience. It was very exciting. It actually just happened on Friday. So that was an exciting addition to the program. And so we're hoping to add more things like that as we make it more of a culture shift than just sort of random practice or process on campus. Okay, so with that said, why don't we jump right into kind of what we already started talking about, which is how do we engage in these practices in other ways on campus? So things that either our classroom learning connects to on campus, but isn't actually in the classroom, or for instance, the restorative practices group I mentioned during the introduction is a way that we kind of incorporate it at Cornell. So this time I'm actually going to start with Lauren.
Thanks. Yeah, a few things come to mind. And you said something earlier about trying to institutionalize these practices. And I think that once you start to think about how to apply restorative practices in your own work, the idea that in order for a student to carry what you're learning in the classroom outside of the classroom, actually, it needs to be reinforced. So I mentioned the co-curricular piece, and one of the things that I see in student affairs and in higher education is a want to utilize restorative practices on campus, a kind of a focus on the responsive use, and as a result, it gets really siloed to the student conduct department or whatever that looks like on various campuses. And one of the things that has been really useful at the institutions where I've worked is to think about this balance of preventative restorative practices and responsive restorative practices, and trying to strike an 80-20 balance. So encouraging folks across the institution to think about the preventative nature of restorative as a leadership tool, as a supervisory tool, as a well-being tool, to brainstorm ways that restorative practices can be used in student health, in the leadership development programs and athletics that are not responsive, so that as a university or as a division, we can start thinking about non-responsive ways to utilize restorative practice in our everyday interactions and in the way that we organize ourselves. So that's been a really successful way of kind of thinking about going around the responsive piece to getting to that 80% what we strive for. We're thinking about the balance of what we want to see on campus.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. Liz, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. So I think, with regard to how we engage outside of the classroom and in other ways on campus, I think it's really, Katrina, you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about culture change earlier, right? And so one thing that we've been focusing a lot on, again, in the past couple of months is really thinking about ways that we can humanize other community members, but also humanize ourselves so that this concept of restorative justice doesn't seem so abstract. I think it's really hard sometimes when you're on a campus that can be really competitive and can, not like encourage people to not make mistakes, but like not normalize mistakes, not normalize conflict, and just like not normalize being a human being that like makes mistakes and has to learn from experiences is tough. But I think that's, in my opinion, kind of at the heart of restorative justice practices, right? Like that none of us really know all of the answers, and none of us are really ever going to be able to do everything right all the time. But the point is that we're a part of a community, and we're all learning and growing together at the same time. And so again, I think that the concept of letting go a little bit, and just really leaning into being creative and really leaning into something that's different and so nuanced, but so simple at the same time is really challenging. And so, yeah, I think at the root of it, it's really been about just humanizing each other and humanizing ourselves so that when we have conversations that are difficult, it's not like, I'm coming for you and we are arguing, and it's not like us versus them, but it's like we are legit all in this together as a community trying to figure out this life and all the things we got to do in it. So
awesome. Thanks. And Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great conversation. Just thinking about, I agree, that kind of idea of shift of cultures. I'm oftentimes preaching that in a program that I do outside of campus, which is actually in a high school. It's a restorative sport and health program in which we're doing PE related. In North Carolina, the PE curriculum actually includes conflict resolution. And so we're doing a PE activity, Taekwondo, and this year actually it's basketball. So we've done different ones, and doing circle process with students to really get them to understand and then take that outside of the classroom. And so the question about like how I do it with my pedagogy sometimes overlaps in ways that it's not in the classroom or out of the classroom, it's all together. It is that kind of shift of culture that you're trying to create in a community. And so when I think about that on my UNCG campus, and so I should say that, my program is rather small. It's a BA and an MA program in peace and conflict studies in one unit on a campus that has multiple units. And I have found in some of my work on campus, in terms of doing conflict resolution trainings or just recently being involved in a bias response team that the Dean of Students has created, that there's really these silos within institutions, really these kind of different sides of campus, if you will. And the Dean of Students office oftentimes has a perspective about what they want to do or what restorative justice might look like or restorative practices might look like, but then how you implement it, right? And so I appreciate as well this kind of reparative versus preventative type of a mindset. And so, like, even going back to the first question, I'm thinking about, one preventative pedagogy in a sense, and I hadn't really always thought about it as restorative, but one of the things I like to do, and I taught at Guilford College, a small Quaker school, before I ended up at UNCG, and they often do a moment of mindfulness at the beginning of their class, or a moment of silence in the Quaker tradition. I call it a moment of mindfulness. And so actually getting students to be mindful, and, Liz, you mentioned humanizing people, right? Realizing that, like, we don't have all the answers, and taking time to be mindful about it as we then go into the world, not just in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, trying to shift the culture away from a punitive mindset to one in which we restore people and see them as human. It sounds kind of floaty-goaty in some ways, I guess, or something, but it's really important work, and it's really not, I would argue, very respected by our kind of neoliberal norms of society. And so I oftentimes describe that kind of shift in culture as also kind of pushing against expert neoliberal capitalist market-driven mindsets, and that's a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of effort, and it's stressful. And there's resistance to it, right? I mean, let's not forget that institutions like to keep the status quo, right? They don't necessarily. Everybody thinks change is hard, right? But and in restorative practices, we're pushing towards change, right? We're trying to get parties to realize that change can be really powerful and really empowering and embodying of the values that we want. But sometimes institutions want to say, whoa, hold on. We kind of like how things are going. We like the status quo, right? And so it is kind of revolutionary in that sense. So I appreciate the conversation, and I think that there's so many ways in which we're doing restorative work in lots of different communities around Greensboro, in my case. And I can think of multiple different projects in lots of ways that kind of restorative value set is kind of implicit, sometimes more explicit, but implicit in almost everything I do.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I would kind of echo the conversation as well. I mean, I think that piece on restorative versus preventative, even thinking about preventative being sort of that community building piece, right? So the impact circles that I mentioned that we just had on Friday was actually, I would say, even though we were talking about the impact of having your first semester at Cornell, was very much about community building, right? Seeing each other as humans, seeing each other with kind of shared experience, knowing you're not alone. Those were some of the kind of highlights that came out of those impact circles, where I think some of the new students maybe thought they were alone in that. So it's just an amazing shift, just even in the understanding of an individual, kind of thinking about that community building piece, and understanding the people next to you, and understanding that you might have some shared experience, and you're not alone in it. I think some of the other ways that we're really striving at Cornell to kind of think about things outside the classroom in particular are we also have a faculty peer mediation program, and a faculty program with our vice provost's office around sort of issues that come up for departments and faculty groups, which has helped us to think through how do we potentially use restorative practices in the faculty space when faculty may be having issues around things like identities and values, and how that plays into their own work. Sometimes it's individual differences, but sometimes it's actually disagreements around value and identity and how it plays a role in research and teaching. And so those have been really interesting conversations that we've started I would say more so this year than any other year, but we've started that over the last 2 years working with that partnership. And then also strengthening some of our other partnerships with, for instance, even our ILR partners, where we have, folks that are looking out for student well-being and things like that, and thinking about how do we provide resources to our faculty members when we have a big event on campus that negatively impacts us. Things like bomb threats or armed gunmen or things like that. We've recognized with experience that just walking into a classroom and pretending like nothing has happened is not something that's going to work for the students. So what does a faculty member then do to sort of, Jeremy, as you said, give that moment of mindfulness, to have a moment of reflection, to be able to acknowledge, yeah, something big happened and it impacted us all. It may have impacted us in different ways, right? But it impacted us all. So looking for those types of both partnerships and how we kind of navigate the space in a way we are doing a lot with students, but it's not solely student centric, right? Because our community is faculty, staff, students, the community outside, our alumni, parents, et cetera. So how do we incorporate all of them in a way that we can make that shift together? Those are big questions. And we do still, see pushback like you're talking about. And I'm sure we're going to get more into that conversation as well. So with that, I do want to shift a little bit and think about, although it's still connected, what have you done research in this area about? Or where do you think we need to have more research or new research and more work? Because those are things that play a role in higher ed in particular, right? Where we have research to kind of back what we're saying and move us forward in any practice. So this time I will start with Jeremy and ask about your research and where you see the research future or other practices in the future.
Yeah, and I do see this as connected. So I mentioned the program that I do at Dudley High School, which is a restorative sport and health program in a 9th grade PE class. And so it's been qualitative research trying to understand how we can shift that culture within our goal was really to shift culture within the school. And so we approached the school initially to talk about ISS, in-school suspension, and maybe we could do work there, and quickly figured out that the PE classroom might be more effective. We're not hitting every student. We're hitting the students as they come in. And so we've been doing this for 3 years. And the hope is that, pretty soon we will have hit each grade level. And, it may take some time to get there, but that's the goal. So most of my research has been qualitative based. I also am doing a evaluation of a restorative peer mediation program in middle schools in Winston-Salem, which is our neighboring county to Guilford County, which is the county I'm in here in North Carolina. And I hope out of that research will come some insights, some directions to show that, hey, this kind of a humanizing approach to restorative peer mediation, conferencing type of a model of response, as opposed to kind of more of a mediation response, is actually really effective, and that other school systems might take it up, right? Because there's a lot of talk about restorative practices, but then implementing it on the ground, I think there needs to be a lot more evaluation research done. And then the last thing that came to my mind as you were talking was just this idea about power, because you were talking about on a college campus having faculty, staff, students, and there's power differentials between those folks in any institution, right, or on any campus. And so I think there needs to be a lot of education around power and power dynamics within a restorative process, as well as this kind of focus on just basic conflict resolution skills. I find that my students at the undergrad and graduate level, for that matter, are really interested, want to do the work. They want to engage in the practice. but they always defer to me or to somebody else who's quote expert, right? And somebody said earlier, we all, nobody's an expert in some ways. We don't know everything, right? We're always learning as humans. And so I'm always kind of in the safe space of the classroom trying to push students to like, no, you do this, right? Like, I don't need to do this. You need to do this. And you need to realize that you have the confidence and the skills, the abilities yourself to do this kind of thing, even though you haven't been trained or taught to do them throughout your whole educational experience. And in fact, maybe we're punished for trying to practice some of these things, or punished and not restored in ways that you're still angry about. And so, it's giving people that confidence to, I struggle with that in my classroom all the time, because I feel like I'm always being pushed back to you need to be the one that do this. And no. Everybody has this innate ability within them, right? And you need to practice it in this safe space so that you can get out and do it in places that might not be quite as safe. So yeah, those are some areas that I think are open for more research. And I'd love to see folks who are listening in today reach out to me and or do that kind of research themselves in their own areas.
Definitely. Those are some great examples. Lauren, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, quickly, I want to say that was really well said, really resonated, Jeremy. I think one of the things that I hear about a lot is it feels really risky to take it on. I think a lot of it has to do with what you were talking about earlier, with kind of brushing up against the values of these institutional kind of neoliberal ideology, whatever it might be, that makes us feel like this is different. We're not used to that feeling and we don't want to mess it up, which is also a very patriarchal, white supremacist way of thinking, right? So restorative practices kind of reminds us of that, but also reminds us of the risk of being different. My research is, I'm really interested in this well-being piece of restorative practices. And so my research looks at one small part of that. I want to know, across all of the literature that's been done, across all the studies that we've seen, what is the thing that makes people feel like they belong once they've engaged in some kind of restorative interaction or restorative intervention? So I've taken a look at that at the K-12 and higher ed level. And this is the area where I really think we need more research, is in higher ed, and that's in the application of restorative practices specifically in higher education. We have some research, some really good research on restorative justice in the higher ed space, but not much looking at RP. We have a lot in K-12, and the thing that we're seeing that makes the difference is the community building pieces of restorative practice, because those can be applied frequently. So the way I like to refer to it is the dosing matters. The dose of restorative practices, experiencing it frequently and consistently, leads to a sense of belonging for those folks who have that opportunity. So the takeaway being that the preventative nature of restorative practice, when we get used to that sense of risk and get past that feeling of challenge, it really makes a difference in our well-being, specifically in our sense of belonging. The other thing that I have recently looked at is receptiveness to restorative practices in K-12 and Baltimore specifically. So in the Baltimore metro area, looking at how folks respond to the idea of restorative practices when they learn that there's the possibility that it will reduce gaps in things like disciplinary referrals and graduation rates and things like that. So that project is ongoing, but really for me gets at how can we educate the people who are both directly involved or considered stakeholders, and indirectly involved but also considered stakeholders in this practice, because the commitment of community members is one of the key components of restorative practices. So figuring out how we can get folks committed and involved and kind of beyond just the what they're hearing about is something of interest to me, and I think to the work.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. Liz.
Yeah. Wow. Lauren and Jeremy both just, so many thoughts, so many things going on in my head. I specifically love what Jeremy was saying about, reminding people of their agency. And then Lauren, you were mentioning that it's, risky talking about these things, especially because we're often pushing up against the system or against an institution because like these concepts are so abstract in some ways, and specifically thinking about this notion of power dynamics and how we disrupt them. My research that doesn't really exist yet, but will eventually, I think will focus mostly on this demographic of student leaders on college campuses, which in my opinion, isn't researched well enough at this point. And I guess the reason why I say that this research is in the works is because it's a lot based on my lived experience, right? So at the beginning of this conversation, I talked a little bit about how it's kind of weird for me to be in this space as like an educator when I literally just got out of grad school in August, and to be like vulnerable for a little bit. Like my undergraduate and grad school experiences were pretty tough. Like my senior year of undergrad was when the pandemic hit and, we had to leave campus, and, I suffered a really bad concussion that spring and have had 2 more concussions since then. And so when I think about pedagogy and access to education, it's so personal for me, because when I was going through my grad program and trying to finish up my undergraduate degree, I literally was like, I cannot sit in front of a computer and write a 20-page paper, like, period. Like it's not possible. My brain functions in a completely different way than it did when I started college and even like during undergrad. And so I've been in this process of refiguring out how I navigate the world as a human, while also like, healing from a couple of traumatic brain injuries and just like being in a new adult kind of in the middle of a crazy world crisis type deal. And so when I think about the student leader demographic, and how a lot of these student leaders are kind of balancing whether they do their schoolwork or they take care of themselves or they advocate for the needs of their communities, and how it's kind of impossible to do all of those things well at the same time. And then when you also think about the fact that a lot of the student leaders who are really passionate about certain projects, those projects are kind of directly related to what they're studying in the classroom, but there's no way to like bridge those gaps in a lot of spaces. And there's no way to, think critically about, like, for using myself as an example, like my undergraduate degree was in communication and my grad degree was in public administration. And I also like had this awesome opportunity to serve on the board of trustees at Cornell, like during my grad career. And so I was like watching this like high level bureaucracy functioning while also studying how institutions and high level bureaucracies function, while also like actively being a student functioning in this system, straddling multiple different spaces and just being like, oh my God, this is crazy. Like there's so much going on. But, at the time, like my MPA curriculum wasn't really even fit for me to be able to analyze those things. Right. And it's tough because I feel like as student leaders, when you're advocating for things, it requires a lot of vulnerability and a lot of honesty, for you to give like context for what you're trying to advocate for. And so when thinking about this in the context of restorative justice, and just like the popular narratives around, being leaders and doing things, I feel like we often expect people to be resilient without teaching them how to do so, and also without being there to support them, to help them back up when they fall. And so I often think about like this picking yourself up by the bootstraps type of deal. And in my case, I'm like, okay, yes, I can pick up the bootstraps, but what happens when I can't hold the bootstraps for much longer because my palms are sweaty and I'm getting like blisters because of how long I've been holding them. Right. And so, yeah, so I think a lot about what it means for student leaders to be so vulnerable, to advocate for themselves. And then when they're doing so, they're often met with the institutional red tape or all of the roadblocks, and not the same type of vulnerability and honesty from the administrative side. Because when thinking about all of these norms of professionalism that we've been talking about already, like, we are not taught to be vulnerable and be honest and be real about what's going on. Like, we've been talking a lot in this conversation about this notion of no one being experts, but like, that's how university spaces function, right? Like, if you're a faculty member, if you're an administrator, you're supposed to have all the answers. End of the day, that's that. And when you don't have the answers, it's not normal for you to say, I don't have the answer. I don't know. Let's figure it out together. The initial response is, okay, here are all of the things that are enabling me from being able to answer this question, which also causes mistrust and frustration from all of the stakeholders on campus. So I think a lot about how do we encourage people, but not even just encourage, like create a system or foster a system, foster culture change where we can all be honest about the fact that we don't know what's going on, but we're all equitable, equal stakeholders here on this campus for however long we're here. And if we want to recruit the best people and yada, 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 then we have to figure out a way to let their voices be heard in a way that's not just them screaming into the void because they want, something to fix their individual circumstance in the moment, right? But being real and honest about, we are entering a new wave of education where this next generation of learners is nothing like we've ever seen before. And so if we don't start being flexible, being agile, being like, okay, we might make a decision today that's not going to work tomorrow, but if it works today, we'll do it today. And tomorrow we got to come back to the drawing board. Like, that's just not, it's hard because it's a lot of change. It's a lot of uncertainty. And it's just like restorative justice, being okay with the fact that it might not play out the way that you want it to. And also being okay with the fact that like uncertainty is inevitable, conflict is inevitable. And that's just how it is. You just gotta push through and respect each other in the process.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. So to kind of jump on to what Liz was saying there. So I'm interested in a lot of different research. One being kind of the lack of diversity in the conflict resolution field more broadly, and so I'm doing some research on that. But particularly in higher education, in the restorative and conflict resolution space, I'm incredibly interested in the systems perspective. So thinking about that system, and Liz talked a little bit about kind of how student leaders fall into that system and what some of the difficulties and barriers are there. One of the things that we've been looking at is how do you take a system that does sort of perpetuate the status quo, because it's a large system in most cases when you're talking about universities. And so having policies and procedures and sort of best practices or common practices is inevitable in that type of a system. So how do you then question trends or systemic oppression when they come up? So we've started to consider that in things like our interactions with the student code of conduct. When we see trends, how do we manage those trends? Who do those trends go to? How do we disrupt the system to say, this is a trend that is probably not okay and is based on a specific identity or is based on something else? How do you shift the thinking around that? And so I'm trying to figure out kind of the both qualitative and quantitative avenues of kind of studying, basically questioning, right, or disrupting systems, specifically in higher ed, which I think gets to that culture change piece, right? Because if we are impacting positively folks on an individual level, that's a wonderful thing. But if the system remains the same, if the structures remain the same, is it really supporting those individuals in the best way possible? And I think those are some of the questions we need to ask, not just in higher ed, although higher ed is my focus, but across systems in different arenas. Okay, so why don't we at this point take a couple of questions from the audience, because we are at 15 minutes remaining. So one of the first questions from Carol is, what books or articles should I read to learn more about how restorative justice is applied? And anybody can jump in on these. I'll give you a second to think.
I'll say a couple things. So there's a little book of series that Eastern Mennonite University puts out, and there's one about higher education that Karp wrote, I believe, and then there's a couple of others that are around restorative. There's one from Howard Zare. So, stuff by Howard Zare, Changing Lenses comes to mind. And then some of the folks, I'm connected with some of those folks at Eastern Mennonite. They're up the road from me. In fact, Carl Stouffer, who used to be there, he's now at USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace, co-edited a book, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but it's about restorative practices and restorative justice as a movement. And then there's another one that came out of California about colorizing. I think it's colorizing restorative practices. Maybe y'all remember, and I can't remember the co-editors on that project, but that's another one. So there's a number of resources relatively new that are out, and lots of research being done in this field. So
I would also echo the little books. The little book on restorative justice on college and university campuses is one that we actually use as required reading in our campus mediation practicum 1. So the students kind of see it from a little bit of a systemic view. It's such an easy read, and it provides kind of the basics of restorative justice with an actual facilitator script in there and everything. Now, I will say that with our students, we open that up to considering, how do I actually say these things in my own voice? How would I modify the script so it's me, so it's authentic? And I would say that's one of the key things that I found with our students.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Katrina.
Nope, go ahead. I was going to say, any other suggestions?
Oh, yeah. I would say for me, adding things to my document repository that aren't specifically on restorative justice is also really important. I think there are a lot of things related to how we have restorative conversations and mediations that aren't again, explicitly written about restorative justice. So what first comes to mind, and I guess building on, what everyone else has been saying about these systems that we function in not being, super flexible in a lot of ways, is The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House by Audre Lorde. Also James Baldwin's collection, a Talk to Teachers. There's this article about anti-racist pedagogy, from faculty's self-reflection to organizing within and beyond the classroom, by Kishimoto. And I've been reading a lot about reconceptualizing leadership from a neurodiverse perspective. So also thinking about the ways that people show up in conversations differently, and what that means with regard to all of our social identities and just how we navigate the world and communicate with others. I think that's something that comes up a lot in Katrina and I's classes, when we talk about social identity, not just related to ourselves, but with the people that are, in the mediations that we work with, how to pick up on things that may, historically have been stereotypes, but use them not to put people in a box, but to have, further understanding of where they may be coming from when they come to the space. I think, again, that's the hard part about a truly restorative approach is it's not just, we're going to be nice and respectful and talk one person at a time and not interrupt each other. But it's we got to be really real about how different we all are as people, and not let that be a barrier to having fruitful conversations just because we may not understand where someone is coming from because it's, a completely different cultural context, right? Or a completely different social context. But being willing and able to sit with the fact that you may not know and having the tools to ask the right questions and inquire about the right things in a way that, again, isn't coming off as like discriminatory, but as a genuine effort to like learn and understand, which, yeah, again, I think those are some of the text outside of the RJ circle are helpful for things like that.
Great. All right. So we have a few more questions. So some of them overlap just a little bit. So we have from Mary, what can we do when admin doesn't want to use restorative practices? So the examples, in 2 instances, I requested that restorative practices be used, but admin moved right to punishment. I'm a professor, but chatting as a parent of a middle school kid. And then also we have a question about specifically kind of the culture change and considering the systems that were embedded within and that are embedded in higher education. Is that really possible? I think those two kind of overlap a little bit. So any thoughts on either of those?
I'm going to address the question about what if admin doesn't want to participate or move forward with restorative. And one of the things that I'll say, which people don't like to hear, because when we talk about this, sometimes it's like at the point of the incident and things have already gotten to the point where we want to respond using restorative. We have to back all the way up to maybe starting out using restorative proactively. So it's sometimes too late, not always, but if you're experiencing resistance, it might not be the best to go into, and confront the resistance, but it might be useful to start with prevention, because I do think that it's easier to get folks, administrators on board with the idea that community building contributes to wellness, contributes to belonging, and start to utilize restorative practices to shift culture from the prevention side so that it's available to you when something goes wrong and we need to repair relationships. So that's one thing I'll offer is start before the incident happens.
Can I just jump in and reiterate that? I was thinking the same thing, that, this idea that sometimes you just have to go back to training people and getting them to I think some of that might come from not understanding what we're talking about in terms of restorative practices. And so trying to model for people, and it may be, oh, it's too late in this case, we need to step back. I'm thinking about a past life. I used to work for a restorative justice organization before I got into academics, and I was trying to do community conferencing type of work in the jurisdiction where I was, and I invited Parks and Rec from that jurisdiction to come and participate. And I first went in with the idea of like, let me try to explain restorative practices to people, and not much came of it. I went back a few months later and I did a role play of an activity of a circle. And one of the guys from Parks and Rec came up to me afterwards. Now I get it, right? And I've had that similar experience, like that like the embodiment of playing that role actually helped him understand. And he's like, I understand now what you're trying to do. Before, and he just admitted, before I didn't know it all. And I'm reminded of that when in the work at Dudley High School here in Greensboro, the county actually said, we're going to put teachers through restorative practices training. IIRP came and did restorative practices training for administrators, teachers. And so there was about 6 or 7 people from the high school that we were working at. And I just had this interaction with one of the teachers. He said, oh yeah, restorative practice, I understand it. I've been through the training. And I thought to myself, but how is this being implemented? You went through the training. So I think oftentimes people get a kind of a broad overview. I understand what RP is, but then how do we implement it is a totally different thing in a system. And that sometimes, and that's a critique of IIRP's training in some ways, is they do a good job of explaining it, but then how does it actually operate on the ground in the place where you are? And so this teacher who said that to me, I kind of started asking those questions. Oh, well, what are you doing? Oh, we don't really know how to do anything. Well, we don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to get there sometime. And I don't think anything's ever come of that. Unfortunate in a way, because all this expenditure of resources and time and money were spent to train these teachers and with little payoff, right? And so I think that's a challenge that we face in RP in general.
So I think that also kind of overlaps with just sort of the confusion in terms of our own socialization, right? So, I mean, there's so many things that sound like restorative justice, social justice, for instance, I mean, in our culture, things like that. And I think people have those assumptions around, oh, I know what this is and I'm not into it, without actually experiencing it. And that experience of it can make all the difference in the world. I would just echo that because I've actually found that in our faculty programs. Some of the restorative practices that we use, they're restorative practices. So we're not saying, hey, we're going to use a restorative justice conference, but we're using restorative practices when we're having facilitated dialogues with them. And it makes a world of difference because they're experiencing it as it happens, as opposed to being sort of provided an idea of this is what may be before you. And would you be willing? So I think it makes a big difference on those preventative measures in terms of the community building and the belonging piece, but also just how we incorporate different practices and let people experience them.
Yeah, and totally echoing that. I think, Jeremy, your example of it being hard for people to conceptualize until they're like actively role playing and in it, I think is key here. Again, and just as Katrina said, like there are a lot of things that sound like restorative justice that I think are also hard for people to wrap their head around until they're actively in the moment experiencing it. For me, I think when talking with administrators or really just like talking with anybody in a position of power, which I guess could be anybody regardless, considering like which position they're in at what time. But it's in my life, it's really been integrating these principles into just the way that I exist as a human, right? And so like when I talk about humanizing people, I feel like when people who know me and people have a relationship with me, like I'm always going to be the person that at the beginning of the conversation, at the beginning of the meeting, at the beginning of class, we're going to spend 15 minutes checking in to see how our weeks have been, right? Like I'm going to ask you about your kids. I'm going to ask you about your parents. And I think it's really about those of us who know what's up and know the power of just humanizing each other and having these like really important conversations that aren't necessarily always as a result of conflict, right? It is us like leading by example, like one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one person at a time. I think, similarly to concepts like empathy, again, it's hard for people to like read the definition and then be like, okay, I am going to be an empath today, right? Like you can't be like, okay, I am going to restore justice in this moment. But it's really just about like, okay, what does rebuilding trust and repairing harm mean? What does it look like? Why is it important? And how can I do that in every interaction that I have, right? I think it's hard sometimes when we try so hard to be intentional that it comes off as like fake, right? Or like you're trying too hard or like disingenuous. But when it's like really like embedded into who you are as, a person, it's like, okay, I'm head on a swivel when I'm navigating when I'm navigating situations, paying attention to who's in the room, how they show up in the room, and then not adjusting myself or changing myself, but just like being aware and cautious and also just like validating their existence as much as I want them to validate mine.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. I have to thank all of you for joining me today. I really appreciate you as individuals and as a panel. This has been an awesome discussion. We do have a couple more questions, but not enough time for them, unfortunately. Hopefully we can get to them in some of our other discussions throughout the series, since this is a 5-part series. And with that said, I just want to make sure everybody's aware our next webinar in the series, our next keynote in the series, will be on Monday, December 12th at 1 p.m. And the name of it is Restorative Changemaking for Student Support Services, Perspectives for Higher Education. And this is going to really focus in on that kind of student support service aspect of restorative justice and conflict resolution on university and college campuses. So again, thank you all so much. You have been an amazing panel. And we hope that all of our audience decides to come back for the rest of the series as well. So hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.